My name is Mary Laatsch Sara, and I'm a granddaughter of Genevieve and Lewis Merrill. And I came to this house as a grandchild. I was born in 1954 in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Both of my parents were born in Hutchinson, Minnesota, and my mother was born in this house and lived in this house with my Aunt Ruth. And my mother's name was Doris May Merrill. My aunt's name was Ruth Maureen Merrill. And this was always a joy to come the 61 miles or so from our home in Minneapolis and come up to my grandparents' house, where there was always a fantastic meal on both sides of our grandparents' heritage. One was German, one was French, one was a bit of an English from the Harrington side. And as skinny little kids, I was always trying to hang with the good cooks that lived in Hutchinson. You know, it was a matter of survival to a certain extent, being the third one down. But it was always a warm and welcoming group that lived in Hutchinson. My aunt lived up 2 blocks to the right near where the Jensen house is. And so if you didn't get enough attention from your grandmother and grandfather, then you go up to Aunt Ruth that did not have children, and you always felt better about yourself when you left, and it's certainly better fed. At any rate, this house had more memories for myself and my siblings than I can tell you. I can tell you one interesting fact was that I could never figure out why dogs were always invited into our dining room and that there was never any crumbs on the floor. It's because Genevieve Merrill, who lived here, had the same tradition that she passed on to her 2 daughters, my mother and my aunt. And it could be a Boston Bulldog under the big table that was always full, or it could have been a Chesapeake Bay Retriever, or it could have been a mutt named Skippy. There was a long line of Cocker Spaniels that were in this home. And as a matter of fact, Ginger, the last Cocker Spaniel that they had, outlived both Genevieve and Lewis Merrill. So dogs were with them forever. And, you know, people say they like dogs better than people. Anyway, you know, there was that tendency, that strong draw toward the devoted spirit. And as you probably cannot see, this is what we considered the entrance of the house straight away off the staircase. And to the right, there was a piano, a stand-up piano. And that piano is where my mother learned to play, and she was an excellent pianist, Doris Merrill Laatsch. And I became the pianist out of my family of 4, the only one that stuck with it, and even started music at Drake University, where I attended undergraduate. So bottom line is that piano in the entryway, and there were you had closets that you could, on either side of the entryway here, and a stones going down. So that's where we entered. And where the camera person is standing right here was where my Genevieve, my grandmother Nana that I called her, sat in a rocking chair. And it was the original rocking. She would sit there and you'd see her thinking as an old teacher. She'd be thumbing the side of her nose, and she was quiet, you know, and we were like 4 kids, wild Indians running around, and I'm sure she was just trying to be patient with, you know, as a former teacher. But she would sit in that chair, and it was Ellen Pendergast's chair. And Genevieve was 5 foot tall. So for a rocker, it was too big. So she cut the legs off. This 1865, you know, historic chair that is pictured in many of the Ellen Pendergast pictures. And so I inherited that chair. I had little cast iron things. So I found somebody that did antique restoration in Madison, and they reconstructed the rockers out of the same wood, and then put the fabric back to what my mother had, you know, shipped off to Virginia when my parents moved there. And so it looks similar to what she used to sit in, right in that position. There was a fireplace to the left, and we would spend Christmases up here, and there was always ginger ale that flowed. I think my Lewis Merrill had stomach problems, so he'd had that stomach surgery that a lot of had during those years. But ginger ale, that was a big beverage. And to my right and down the hallway was the dining room, big long dining room, and then into a yellow kitchen. Yellow was the color. It was warm. It smelled good. You know, I wasn't allowed to cook. And, you know, you could tell who was allowed to cook. Genevieve had direct access over her oldest one, and Aunt Ruth was a dynamite, cook. Genevieve was in charge of doing, she could do lemon meringue pie that I remember to this day. The meringues were this high. Aunt Ruth Merrill Peterson, she could do pot roast, and she could do apple pie with, she'd be picking up flour. There was no measuring, it was just done. My mother, she was a good cook, I would say. Fried chicken, she could do all the things, but she was not directly in on that training session that Genevieve had with Ruth. You could tell the difference. But she was busy. Ruth didn't have any kids. She could be whatever. And they were social. My mother was a social animal. There's a reason why I'm the social animal. I'm involved in women's organizations that help other women, and cooking is such a big part of it. Aunt Ruth, Genevieve, and Doris were always entertaining and feeding. I still feed people. Somebody's looking thin in Madison and older, and you're coming over for lunch. I mean, it's just there. And I'm sure that's because Genevieve came from a large farm, and there was lots of food was necessary to energy. And the recipes, I was the only one that was interested in all of the recipes. So I have both the German side where the kolaches and all the, wonderful recipes there, but this was definitely, and the difference was the Merrills had the dishes that were inherited for generations down. So I got a bridge set. Can you imagine? Franciscan discontinued pattern of bridge set. They played cards. So you had a formal set. You had all these women that had entertained before. So there was putting on the dog. I got an original silver set from before Genevieve was on the scene, because I know for a fact that she had silver plate. But whoever is entertaining yet to be, researched and documented, they just had these things. And when you're in a state this early, you have, and you have Victorians. Can you imagine the warehousing you can do 2 blocks up the street? This was not a huge house, but Aunt Ruth had the house for storage and no children. She rented out her upstairs to teachers for years. So it was the ideal conditions for entertaining, for growing. And I know there were gardens here, and it would be wonderful fun to research. I know I got that gardening gene, so I'm like, I still have produce that I grow in my city lot, in front of the bushes that they give you when you buy the house. But those strawberries, there's raspberries that have been established. I've been in my home for 32 years. And so I get this sense I have to do this. It's just, I have an apple tree, and I use my produce. I do jams, I do whatever. But I remember my garden, my grandmother gardening when she was quite an older woman, and she was down to peonies, though. But there was all that cellar downstairs that it was a great spot to discover. Marianne, don't go down there while I was down there. The old jars. People had been canning for years here. People had been growing gardens for years here. So that's a whole nother thing. It's wonderful to have the paint done, but it's those other types of things that kept people on the planet through smart feeding. But they had these 3 women that were illuminating for the ice cream social. They were hard acts to follow in this day and age. But if you can clear the clutter out of your minds and shut the door on the rest of the world and go back to that simpler time, that's where I am mentally in my late 60s. So as far as telling more stories, I can tell more stories, but I'm Right now, are we going to be on the move a bit?